Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone, uh, and welcome to this briefing, which, as you know, is part of a series of virtual briefings with the support of Wilderness Foundation Africa and ICCF. And thank you particularly to the honourable members for being here on a Friday afternoon. And as always, thank you to the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee for hosting this briefing. Thank you, Honourable Klasa. So today we are discussing climate change. Undoubtedly, how we modify our behavior in order to ensure the future existence of our planet is the most pressing question of our time. The recent Presidential Climate Change Commission serves as a reminder of the urgency, I believe, of this issue also for South Africa. So to discuss this very hot topic, pardon the pun, I'm privileged to introduce our speaker today, which is Kumi Naidoo. Now, I think many of you might know, but Kumi was born in Durban, Hannah, and at a very young age became an anti-apartheid activist. This led to his expulsion from school at the age of 15 and numerous arrests. He eventually went into exile, and not only did he then finish his studies, but having obtained a Rhodes Scholarship, he received a PhD in political sociology at the University of Oxford. In 2009, he became International Executive Director of Greenpeace International, and in 2018 was appointed Secretary General of Amnesty International. As of middle of last year, he is the first global ambassador for Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. He serves as professor of practice at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. He's a visiting fellow at Oxford University and an honorary fellow at Magdalen College. Phew. So I have to tell you, Kumi is one of the most impressive speakers and people I know. And just to also explain something to you, at the moment, he's on a motorbike trip through the Northern Cape. I forget now from where, he can tell us from where. So I'm really thankful that he made it to a venue where there was internet and that he was willing to interrupt his trip to give us this time. So Kumi, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you everybody for inviting me to speak to you. I'm actually heading to Cape Town to visit a former member of parliament, mainly, Craig's governor, and brother Pat, who, as you might know, lost their dad, Ronnie Governor, who was an amazing playwright and a cultural activist of note. And when I was a young activist on the run, he actually took care of my disguises. And so I have a very sad and happy sort of memory at this moment. But I thought I'd just start off with one optimistic thing and one sort of challenging thing. I'll start off with the good news. The good news is you probably heard people like me say, save the planet, save the environment, save the climate. The good news is the planet is just fine. The planet actually does not need saving. If humanity continues on the trajectory that we're on, the end result is we warm the planet up to a point where we're losing, as we are in Africa, our water resources, our soil resources, and the temperatures getting higher for making it prohibitive for agriculture to happen. So just be very clear that the planet does not need us to save it, that the challenge is whether humanity can fashion a way to coexist with nature for centuries and centuries to come. So what needs saving is humanity, because the trajectory we're on, and the good news is, if we do continue the path that we are, end result is we'll be gone, the planet will still be here. And once we become extinct, then the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So don't worry about the planet. We need to recognize urgently that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is nothing more and nothing less than protecting our children and their children's futures. We have, though, the second point as introduction, we have the challenge of having been living in the decade that could be, as many are saying now, the most consequential decade in the history of humanity, these 10 years that we are, actually 9 years left. Because in 2018, the scientific community, the IPCC, gave a very, very clear message. They said we had 12 years then to get emissions to peak and start coming down rapidly, at least, back to 2010 levels. And right now, if anybody had money to bet, you can bet that as a collective humanity, we're not going to be able to succeed to do that. Now, why the important positive news is that we've won the debate, right? We don't have to convince people anymore that climate change is something that we need to address. The problem we have is the urgency and the pace of the change is nowhere near what is actually needed. And it's probably worth just stopping for a second to reflect a little bit on why it's been so challenging. The issue with climate change, it's not as if you can just point to a flood or a drought and say that's climate change, because there'll always be people who say, we've always had droughts, we've always had floods, for example. But there is no question the intensity, the ferocity, the velocity as all out of the charts right now. What we are seeing is you don't, in fact, quite frankly, you don't even need the science to be as explicit as they're being. All you have to do is listen to what Mother Nature itself is saying through extreme weather events. So the current moment, though, is also teaching us one of the major mistakes that how we've addressed climate change was dealt with. And I want to just personalize it a bit, right? Reference was made to the fact that I grew up in Durban. I mean, when I was growing up in Durban as a young activist in the anti-apartheid movement, we sort of thought generally that environmentalism was what rich people and white people did. And it was then a wrong idea. Maybe that's how it manifests itself in practice. But if you look today, when climate impacts or environmental crises hit, it is the poor that pay the biggest price, even in rich countries. If you look at Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, the rich jumped into the 4x4s and drove away. So when politicians sometimes say, we're concerned about jobs, it's, those of us who've been pushing for action on climate change are also concerned about jobs. And we've been arguing, which now some governments, powerful governments, including the Biden administration, have finally got it, that in fact, you can get a double win by addressing climate purposefully and energetically. That if you consciously made the changes from an economy that's driven by dirty brown fossil fuel-based energy to an economy that's driven by green renewable-based energy, multiple studies show that the job creation potential is much more than sticking with the fossil fuel dependency that we have. The other question is the absence of intersectionality in our understanding. So, it's really important that we recognize that gender equity is a climate issue, that urban development is a climate issue, and basically every issue that we are dealing has a climate component to it. Now, the reality we are in right now, if we are brutally honest with ourselves, is that we are heading for extinction. Now, that doesn't sound like a very nice thing to say, but the science is crystal clear, and governmental action collectively, globally, is way below where we need to be. So right now, what you are seeing is a new upswell of consciousness and action by ordinary people on the ground. You're seeing parents organizing, you're seeing grandparents organizing, you're seeing children organizing. Yes, it's true that some of those organizations are currently much stronger in the north than they are in developing countries. But from what I know from the networks that I'm part of and so on, you can see that today there will be a consequence for inaction and silence by any political party or government in power if they do not act with the urgency to address the climate thing. Now, the last point I want to make, because I want to keep it interactive, is this. I want to say very strongly, as somebody who's been in the climate movement, that the part of the problem is in fact the climate movement for multiple reasons. One is they did not make the intersection as they should have. Secondly, they have consciously not brought out the human-centric impacts of climate change sufficiently. And thirdly, this just to choose three, we've tended to talk in ways that exclude people. So like even, if you look at I just want to give you a small story. When I joined Greenpeace as the head of Greenpeace in 2009, I went straight to Copenhagen for the climate negotiations. And I was sitting with my Greenpeace colleagues and, getting briefed about what was going to be happening at the COP. And within 10 minutes, I had to about 20 times turn to the person next to me and say, what exactly does that acronym mean? What exactly does that mean? Like, for example, I remember people were going on about LULUCF. I don't know whether any members of committee here actually know what LULUCF. If you don't know what LULUCF is, don't worry. But LULUCF stood for land use change for forestry. Now, just to give you that example, that to even participate and navigate the conversations around climate change, it has become unnecessarily complex. And part of the challenge of both progressive political leadership as well as activism is to actually try to demystify this thing that is seen as an environmental issue, but to make sure that it is seen as fundamentally an issue of human rights and an issue of survivability. I just want to conclude by saying that in with the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the response of those with power was system recovery, system protection, system maintenance. What was needed then and what is needed now is system innovation, system transformation, and system redesign. Your Excellencies, I want to say to you very humbly, if we think we are going to address the question of climate or inequality or any of the other challenges we face without addressing the question of an unjust economic system that gives birth to an unjust and broken energy system, food system, transport system, health system, and so on, then we have a problem. Let me just say that all the comments that I've made is not specific to South Africa. South Africa is inflicted by the same realities, but this is a global reality. The last thing I would say is that with the COP coming up in Glasgow, the next 6 to 9 months will be more items sort of focus on climate questions. And the main thing that is supposed to happen at this climate negotiations in Glasgow is to go back to 2015, look at the commitments that were made. They're wholly inadequate, and look at whether Glasgow, that negotiation in November, December, can generate what's called a refreshed commitment and a set of commitments that is much more aligned to what the science is saying is urgently needed now. In the interest of time, I'm going to stop there and hand it back to Melanie so I can answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Kumi. I asked Kumi to let's keep it very interactive with members so that it's a conversation. Maybe please can members just indicate to me if they want to speak or ask a question or make a comment. Maybe I can just kick off while people are thinking and ask, if you had to mention 2 or 3 things that you think is most urgent for South Africa to do in terms of climate change, what would you say?
The first thing is we have to come to terms with the fact that we cannot continue to have a dependency on coal at the extent that we have it right now. That we will end up with stranded carbon assets, as is going to happen to other countries around the world. So basically, we need to turn this challenge of climate change into an opportunity. So for example, every month that we drag our feet, we kind of say the right words and don't implement and so on, is not only reducing our ability to address climate impacts, but we also are undermining our long-term economic strength. The successful countries of the future are going to be those that get as far ahead of the green technology curve now, right, and not delay, right, and to ensure that we are planning the future, having a climate consciousness in everything that we do. So, for example, when we look at our electricity thing, so if I can just say, the second thing I would say is address energy extremely consciously, right? And yeah, you know, when government was considering a nuclear deal, which was and still is an idiotic idea for multiple reasons, right? One of the ideas we were saying is we recognize that we do have a challenge with meeting our electricity needs, but what we should be thinking about is looking at what's happening in many countries around the world, in the north and the south, where, for example, in South Africa, why would we not commit for rural electrification? Let's say if we are serious about taking rural people out of energy poverty, we would not be thinking about big grids and Eskom's current approach. We would be thinking about micro solar grids. And I tell you, just if you take one corruption scandal of the Guptas and look at how much of money that was wasted, we could electrify at least about 20 villages in our country, right? I can give you the figures if you want. So basically, we need to approach climate with a job creation mentality in mind and an what the economy looks like in the future. And if I can just give you sort of two examples, and this might sound like I'm being a bit crude, but bear with me. I had the opportunity to address the African Union on its 50th anniversary at the Mo Ibrahim Foundation conference, and I ended up saying the most undiplomatic thing there, where I said, listen, when I was a student, when I was a visiting scholar at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, I discovered that Uppsala runs its buses on human feces. I didn't know that was possible. Okay, so just, basically shit, right? I don't know whether one can use such words in the parliamentary committees, but I'll take a chance. So I was quite fascinated by it. I went to the central bus station, was walking behind the buses, smelling really hard to see if, I could smell any poo. No problem. The only problem was in Sweden was they were running out of shit, because basically that particular municipality had to negotiate to get, from other municipalities and so on. Then Bristol in England also runs the buses. And when I went to the African Union and said, listen, I refuse to accept that African shit is inferior to European shit. We have to just get our shit together and turn the crisis of climate change into opportunity. If I can just give you another example. 4 young girls in Zambia, right, 5 years ago, designed a generator that can give you 5 hours of electricity run on 1 liter of human urine, right? And that project actually made it to the African Science and Technology Fair that year. But because it's for rural use, there is not the same kind of money to make with big infrastructure projects with coal and so on, it never goes anywhere. Bottom line is, we have to be making choices. That's what I'll say to our government. We have to be making choices on the one hand that makes us more climate resilient, but we have to be conscious about how that's going to help build our economy going forward. And I think it is possible, and there are multiple examples around the world to show that this can be done, including in Africa itself. Thank you.
Thank you. General, I saw you put your camera on. Have you? Yes, go ahead. I think you muted though.
Thank you, Melanie. Kumi, you are still occupying the crease, young man. I can see you are firing with all cylinders. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. It's good to hear you.
I think in the case of South Africa, we need to make sure not to repeat the mistakes of the past, that this debate is targeting these big cities only, and that we leave the rural areas. what I've observed is that the land which used to belong to the homelands is lagging far behind in terms of the infrastructure development as compared to the land which was once controlled solely by the National Party. Whether you look at their farms, you look at their water system, but if you go to areas like Kwanongoma, the Transkei, Ciskei, Bophuthatswana, and so on and so on, you are able to see that we are still resembling a sort of a third world infrastructure. So if, for instance, we were to talk about job creation, I'm sure if we were to say to our rural people that, look, the desertification has arrived, and we need, therefore, that the government must tell us how do we stop that, planting grass, and also the biodiversity programs themselves are also affected. There are none, in fact, in those areas. Hence, you see the exodus of many people coming to the cities and leaving their better homes and come and sit and stay here in the shacks. So we need to be holistical when we approach or talk about the climate change, because if you look at the storms which have visited those areas, they normally wiped the whole village, and we don't have a counter to that. So when we talk about this, please, 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 members of parliament, my colleagues, let's talk about the entire South Africa, the rural, what effects will, what will be the effects if this climate change affect the rural areas or attack the rural areas, and also in the cities. But in the cities, sometimes it's better because we've got trees. But I can't say of the townships. So let us make use of this climate change to fix some of the problems we have inherited. The backlogs and imbalances of the past are still haunting those areas. And unfortunately, they are affecting the country's production on food in those areas, because our biodiversity programs are nil. Thank you.
Melanie, can I just firstly support all those comments and just add one more thing to that, and that is, I see the rural areas of our country both as an extreme challenge, in the sense that after so many years of liberation, the underdevelopment and so on. But I think the way we must approach it is a mindset that our rural areas offer us opportunity, and the communities that live there could benefit as well as potentially. I mean, part of why I did this trip, by the way, that I'm on, is I'm trying to understand some of the technological things that are happening at the global level and how could it play out here. So let me give you one example. For example, there's an initiative out of Germany called Desert Tech, right? There's a study that's been done decades ago showing that if we could harness 6% of the daily sunlight that is found in deserts around the world, just 6%, we would have more energy than we need to power the whole planet, right? The problem, of course, is where are deserts and how do you, pipe electricity and so on. But these questions are being addressed through technology, and the technology is actually catching up. So our rural areas, could, and already, like if you look at Northern Cape, we've got wind farms as well as concentrated solar. And that's because we've got land that actually is not being actively used. So I guess the only nuance that I wanted to bring to my brother's earlier comment was to say, yes, agree with all of that. But in terms of our mindset, let's change our mindset and let's look at the rural areas as places of opportunity rather than only looking at them as places of burden. Thank you.
Thank you. Honorable Bryant, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Melanie. Oh, looks like I'm sideways. Am I sideways? I might be. I'll turn my camera off. Just very quickly, thanks so much for the privilege to be able to interact with Kumi. I think he is an international luminary and someone who we can learn a lot from. So it really is fantastic to have this opportunity. Just a couple of things. The first one is just a point that's coming out of the Climate Change Commission meeting yesterday, where there was a presentation that was quite explicit in terms of the cheapest potential energy sources, the most viable in terms of job creation, pointing directly towards solar and solar potential. And I think that's a very encouraging sign. Obviously, the challenge now is making sure that we get that transition from coal to other renewable sources and gas over a period of time. But I think it is certainly something which we should be pushing and promoting as a way for us to try and lower our own carbon footprint as a country. But just a couple of points on what Kumi raised. The issues around products and sort of innovative products in terms of electricity generation. I know one of the challenges, and this is just from my experience working in local government, is that often people within rural communities or underprivileged communities are quite apprehensive about, almost acting as guinea pigs for some of these products. And it certainly is something which I fully understand, that, if this new innovative product comes out and it's this, a way for us to do the same thing, but at a reduced cost and, with something which is a little bit untested. Often people within underprivileged communities and rural communities are saying, we don't want to be the guinea pigs. We want the things that, the guys in the more built up areas and the urban areas and the more privileged societies have. And I think perhaps the first step, it might sound counterintuitive, but perhaps the first step is for us to actually trial these things within our more privileged communities before we take them to the rural communities, so that we don't end up with a scenario, where people are rejecting these things based on the fact that they haven't been properly tried. But I do think there's a heck of a lot of potential for these things to to be rolled out. I don't know how we'd sell the one with the poop, but for me personally, I think it's quite exciting if we can get it going. My real question is just in terms of electric vehicles, and I know there's a lot of discussion around electric vehicles, and not only electric cars, but electric buses. But there's obviously a challenge, with regards to that and environmental concerns, and that's obviously the lithium mining that goes along with it. And I know there are particularly issues in Portugal and some other parts of the world where lithium mines are now being set up. I just want to know what Kumi's kind of take on that and potential issues going forward, and whether it's something that that they've looked into, and whether they could give any advice to us in terms of lithium mining, particularly going forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those comments and the observations. Before I speak to the electric vehicle question, can I just say that the issue about the cost of solar, has been coming down, right? And for some time, and the sort of terrible reality is, in many countries around the world, in rich and poor countries, developed and developing, so-called, one of the things I've come to realize is that because the supply chain of corruption is much shorter in renewable energy projects than in a big fossil fuel infrastructure project, right? There is a hesitancy by elites at the top not to go down the route of more decentralized provision. Now, let's be very clear. You can do solar in multiple ways. Some countries are going to opt to go just for big concentrated solar plants, which then pipes electricity long distances. I'm not saying that can't be part of our energy mix, but I ask a simple question. Why, given the urgency that we face, we cannot turn every roof of every home, school, business, place of worship into two things? One, an income generator, and the other, a electricity producer as well as an income generator. So in multiple countries around the world, you have what is called a feed-in tariff. So, for example, if you have solar panels and they generate about 100 units of electricity and you use 75 units of electricity, then that 25 units you can feed into the grid and you get a compensation for it financially. If you had a system like that, Eskom does not need to run any save electricity adverts. There would be a built-in incentive for people to save. But also what you do is you make people part of the process of generating electricity, getting more sensitized to it and so on. But the elephant in the room, right? The elephant in the room, which we are not prepared to acknowledge, is on the municipality revenue situation that we have. Right, municipalities supposedly are heavily dependent on revenue from electricity sales. Now that cannot be a justification. There should be a better plan to address that question of municipal revenues and finances, rather than imposing an energy system that is harmful, financially inefficient, and so on. On the electrical vehicles question, thank you so much for raising that, because you know, quite often people ignore the fact that actually you can do certain things in the name of addressing climate change and renewable energy and so on, but actually engage in lots of human rights violations in the process. So for example, there are companies that are getting really good vibe in Europe amongst their customer base because they went somewhere in Latin America and set up a solar plant or a wind farm. But oftentimes they're going and setting it up on indigenous people's lands without free, prior, and informed consent, for example. So we have, and then the issue about the electrical vehicles is a particularly big issue. And it has a huge African dimension to it as an issue, right? And that is, I'll just tell you a quick story. I did the keynote address to the Electric Motor Vehicle Association 2 years ago, and basically went there to challenge them on getting their supply chain sorted out, because one of the worst labor exploitations we see in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where young children are having to mine for cobalt and so on. And basically these rare earth materials, if you take DRC out of the equation, you have almost no, the world cannot have supplies for cell phones, batteries, and so on. So we have to not address the problem on the one hand by creating another problem, is what I would say. And thankfully, the Electric Motor Vehicle Association recognizes that they cannot pass that burden to their providers.
Thank you. I also saw in the newspapers, I think yesterday, that there's only 97 or something like this electric vehicles were sold last year in South Africa. So it was interesting that is clearly, not going anywhere yet in South Africa. I just want to explain, before I give Honorable Winkler a chance, I just want to explain to some of the members who joined us late. Kumi is actually in Hopefield. He's actually in the middle of a very epic motorbike journey. And this is why, if you're wondering what's going on behind him, that's where he is. And he very graciously agreed to interrupt his journey, find some Wi-Fi and speak to us. So thank you for that. Just wanted to explain because there's, some stuff going on behind you. Honorable,
politically correct. I say I didn't find a politically correct background here, which is various seeds that we need to be planting.
That's good. Honorable Winkler, go ahead.
Thank you, Melania, and thank you, Kumi. It's a real pleasure to be on part of this discussion today. So I think something that Kumi touched upon was the just transition. And obviously that seems to be a major obstacle to this very accelerated decarbonization. And the problem is that there seems to be that tension almost between, our climate targets and development. But the way that we sort this out, as far as my understanding is that we need to start transitioning to a green economy where we create better jobs, more sustainable jobs, more jobs. But there seems to be, I think, some hindrance at some level. We're not creating the proper regulatory environment to encourage, decarbonization, to create these new jobs. And there seems to always be a tension between conservation and really poor communities, because a lot of communities rely on the natural resources that may fall within protected areas, etc. So it seems like the way to address this at the core is to accelerate into a green economy. But I'm just wondering, Kumi, from your experience and what you've seen abroad, and from what you know, the context in South Africa, how do we even start, to broach this issue of the green economy, and to show that it's not anti-developmental or a hindrance to growth? Where do we start with this, and how do we convince the policymakers in government that this is the route that we should be taking for everyone, for development, for poor communities, and for the planet, and for climate? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. So the Green Economy Coalition, which is the sort of social movement advancing the idea of green economy, it's about 10 years old now. They are now pushing for what they call a social contract to redefine the terms of the relationship between leaders and citizens, because basically in every country around the world, we're seeing that the social contract between the governed and the governors, or the leaders and the led, is completely broken. You're seeing very low levels of public support for our leaders. You see people across the world saying, things like, when I go to vote, I don't go to vote for the best candidate, I go to vote for the least worst candidates, and so on. And this is, therefore, our response cannot be just the green economy. And therefore, the Green Economy Coalition, I'm pleased to say, I've said it has, the post-COVID approach should be both equity balanced with sustainability. And that's something that I think has been a missing link, because usually we were not dealing with equity. And for me, I would say equity is meaningful growth. I think there's another long conversation about what kind of growth we need in the future. And I would argue that the way we measure growth and wealth right now is problematic. In the interest of time, if I can just refer you to a book by Lorenzo Foromenti called GDP, Gross Domestic Problem, the world's most powerful number. And if we look at how GDP is calculated, it's highly problematic. If you go chop down a forest, that's on the plus side of GDP, for example. So a lot of environmental degradation and so on. But I just want to quickly go to the just transition question. So just to be clear, right? Historically, as some of you know, people used to talk about red-green tensions. These were tensions between labor and environment. And because always it was said, the environmentalists want to protect everything and so on. When I joined Greenpeace as a non-conventional appointee who didn't have a big background in environmentalism, I went in partly to help them make that connection, right? And so one of my first things I did was reached out to somebody who I'd worked with in previous roles, globally, called Sharon Burrows. She's one of the most impressive people on our planet. She's the first woman to lead the global trade union movement. And I can tell you that the single most powerful line on climate did not come from an environmentalist, came from Sharon Burrows and the trade union movement. When we were having a meeting with the Secretary General of the UN around Rio +20, she said, Secretary General, you might be wondering why I, as a trade unionist, am so committed to the question of climate action, because she said, as a human being, as a mother, and as a trade unionist, I realize there are no jobs on a dead planet. There are no jobs on a dead planet. So Sharon and I then began to forge what we call the Red-Green Alliance, which was, listen, let's find ways in which we don't fight each other, but we actually find common ground. And we have done, amazing, we have made amazing progress in that respect. But that meant that we needed to get environmentalists and people outside of the labor movement talking with honesty and seriousness and showing that they really cared about the workers that worked in those industries. So, for example, I constantly call the people that work in oil, coal, and gas our brothers and sisters, because we cannot blame the people that work in those industries. Society told them, you are playing a very important role. You're delivering energy to power the economy of your country, right? That's an honorable role to be told, to play. And suddenly they're being told, shoo, you're killing your own children's future by engaging. So just transition is basically saying, we must not punish the people who work in those industries. We need to ensure that what we do is, for younger workers, we are retraining them and retooling them so that they can succeed and prosper in the renewable energy technology sector. And by the way, there are lots of not that complicated skills transference that can happen, not necessarily cut and paste, but with not that much of effort to empower certain people in the fossil fuel industry, especially young people, to be able to transition. For older people, probably those that cannot be retrained and close to retirement, there has to be some compensation that is fair and just, because we should not punish the people whose fault it has not been for the problem that we find ourselves. But I just would say, though, when you look at it on a global basis, just transition gets a little bit complicated, because if there is a global pot of money, right, to help with this transition, right, then, how much of that money goes to privileged workers in the global north, in the fossil fuel sector, in the North Sea and so on, who are extremely well paid. And we have a major disconnect between what fossil fuel workers in the global north receive versus, say, an average oil worker in Nigeria would receive. So there is some equity issues about how it gets explained, but there is no question, if we want the union movement and working people to support climate action, we have to be serious about ensuring that how we transition from the industries that need to be phased out to new industries that need to be built has to be fair, transparent, equitable, and just. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I check Honorable Mbata, Hunu, Honorable Singh? Anybody want to say something? Honorable Singh, you were first on with your camera. I know you came in a bit at the tail end.
Hi, Melanie, and hi, Kumi. Good to see you again. Melanie, I've just had a string of meetings with Secretary to Parliament, with Auditor General, everybody else. So I just joined the talk, but it's good to hear Kumi's comments, and I think my colleagues have covered a lot of ground. We've still got a lot of work to do in our country. I mean, my son-in-law was telling me he was in Denmark the other day. We talk about rural communities, impoverished communities, and he says he went to what looked like an ATM machine, and he saw a little old lady come next there and remove containers, etc., and put it into this machine. Like it was like a receptacle. And as she put it in, within a few minutes, there was money coming out. So, I mean, that's creative, that's innovative. I don't know if we're doing that kind of thing. And maybe Kumi, with your international connections, you know, must find out how this works, because everybody wants to be rewarded for, you know, whatever good they can do, particularly those, you know, those that are unemployed. And let's give them opportunities in that regard when it comes to recycling. But with regards to solar, I heard the comments about rural areas, and you know, perhaps, you know, more pilot programs and you know, we've got a number of rural municipalities and areas in KwaZulu-Natal. I mean, you are a Durban boy like me. We've got a number of areas, and you know, if you want to try something out in one of those outlying areas, please feel free to contact me, and with the committee we can work and get something going. Because I think people want to see something successful. And if a thing works in area A, it can be translocated elsewhere. But I mean, you know, the problems we're having in Devon South with those refineries. I mean, why should they be doing what they are doing when, if they were located in Denmark or in the UK or wherever else, they would ensure that they adhere to the regulations, strict regulations. We know what's happening in Mpumalanga with pollution by state-owned entities, you know, Eskom and others, and then being allowed to get away with it. So I mean, it's going to be a long haul, but if we don't spend money, we're not going to make money or save money in the future. So sometimes it might be a large investment, whether it's an international donor or whatever, but in the medium to long term, we're going to save this earth more than anything else. And if we save the earth, we're saving money. So those would just be my comments for now. Thanks, Kumi.
Thank you. Just want to say thank you for raising that, because one of the things that I think we don't fully realize, that there is a lot of cash in trash, right? It's not just a question of doing the right thing, but you know, if we just created an enabling environment for things to be separated, collected, and so on, there's a huge amount of value in it, right? And there are examples of other places in the world where they're doing it well, even in countries like Egypt and so on. So and I would just say that, you know, it's important that we also think about things that are not visible to us. Like, for example, if you can just pick up a small issue, and that is the issue, well, a big issue, and that is the quality of our soil in South Africa, right? The soil quality globally is a huge problem. On the continent, it's a massive problem. You know, the Sahel, you know, we got, if you take Darfur, right? Darfur, the genocide there was probably the first major resource war brought about by climate, because Lake Chad, one of the largest inland seas in the world, and according to a former Secretary General of the UN, it's shrunk to the size of a pond, right? And so we have to be thinking about rebuilding our ecological integrity. And can I just say one thing? You know, while we focus a lot on climate, as we should, we must be also mindful that there are other ecological boundaries that are also being broken, you know, exceeded and so on. So we have to look at other areas of ecological collapse. And I would say soil quality and soil integrity, it's not talked about, most of us who live in urban areas and so on, but our food production depends on that. And some of our practices don't actually protect the long-term integrity of our soils and so on. But if you think about that, it's also about how do we, you know, if you ask our kids today, you know, where does food come? They'll probably tell you it comes from Checkers or Woolworths or Pick and Pay, right? The absence of knowledge about food production and the fact that people have lost it is a very negative thing. And even in terms of thinking about how we produce our food in the future, we're going to be talking about urban farms, we're going to be talking about vertical agriculture and so on. And these are the things that are happening in many places around the world. And I think we need to be open look at what's happening, see what works for us, adapt it if necessary, reject it if it doesn't work for us. But let's have some humility also to look not just at the rich countries, but look at what poor countries mainly are doing to cope with addressing climate, and you'll find that there's lots of innovation, which by the way, Naren, is not always high investment. Some of it can actually be medium to modest investment, but the actual investment that is really needed is political will, and that's what can only come from the top, from our government. Thanks.
Just before I see if there's still anybody else, just on the issue of topsoil, I actually read something last night which said that modern agriculture in America is wasting 1 inch of topsoil every year that they destroy. I don't know exactly how much is an inch, but it's not. And it takes nature 1,000 years to create that same inch again. So the crisis of topsoil being destroyed by modern agriculture is actually a huge crisis, which, like you rightly say, we're not looking at enough. Can I just see, is there anybody else who still wants to ask a question or make a comment before I hand over to the chairperson to just say a few words?
Melanie, just one thing, you're talking about topsoil. Interestingly, about 2 weeks ago, I was in the Clan William area, near you. Well, not near, 200 kilometers away from you. So I went to a wine farm, Cederberg. And when I spoke to the owner of that farm, David Niewert, his focus is not at what grows above the soil, but what is in the soil. And his whole entire focus and the success of his farm is soil quality, what's in the soil, and how do you develop the soil and how you preserve the soil. So I think it's an important area. And maybe when you got some time, take a ride and see David Niewert. Thank you.
I can see there's going to be a request for a field trip to this to this wine farm, right? Can I check anybody else still? Are we good to go? Okay, Chairperson, would you like to say a few words just before I close the meeting? I think you're on mute though. There we go.
Thank you very much. No, thank you very much first for organizing the session. I know that we are a little bit difficult in terms of coming together because of pressure of Parliament and many other activities. But thank you for being patient with us and try and push. Thank you to members for honoring the session, as well as to our guest speaker. I hear that is traveling. And thank you for allowing us this opportunity. And thank you for responding to the questions. I think as we are approaching Glasgow, we are beginning to talk almost every day about climate change and what needs to be done. So it's always good to hear all the different voices about this matter. And every day we're getting something new. And I also noted a few things that I thought as part of my vote of thanks I should just raise. I don't know how odd it would be for the guest speaker to respond to that. He mentioned, as he was talking, that climate change should not just be taken as an urban issue, urban development issue. No, he mentioned GBV, gender-based violence. I didn't know how he would explain that. I think the other issues he mentioned, I understand. The issue of urban development and the impact of climate on everything else, but he talked about gender-based violence. So that was just one thing, but I think generally the honorable members who talked about renewable energy and the attitude of the rural areas. I think it has to do with history. It's not only about them not understanding that renewable energy might be cheaper, but I think it has to do with how we have been brought up to see that we are treated differently, those of us who come from the rural areas. So I think it's a question of education, experimentation generally, and them accepting that we are actually sincere about what we want to do. I think that's but raising it as members have done, I think it's an issue. But I think generally we can all agree it's cheaper. Renewable energy would be cheaper. But I think those who are supposed to be beneficiaries, and that comment that said must not treat rural areas as just a place of death, must be a place of opportunity. I think I agree with that 100%. So there's a lot that we need to do. Otherwise, thank you very much. Like I'm saying, just that GBV
Thank you.
comment.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chairperson. I'm so glad you asked for clarification there. If I might, this is such an important issue. So in 2002, 2003, the CIA, which then had a massive climate intelligence unit, and the head of intelligence in South Africa at that time, Mo Sheikh, was in lots of intensive discussions with them and collaborating. That got shut down by Trump. But in 2002 already, they produced a report saying that in the coming decades, the biggest threat to peace, security, and stability will not come from terrorism, will not come from conventional threats, but will come from the impacts of climate change. And the Chad Darfur example is one. There are multiple examples that we can show right now that the hand of climate is very, very active in conflicts. So that's one point. Second point then is, we know that whenever there's war and conflict, women and children pay a disproportionate level of disproportionate price in terms of pain and suffering. So if we say climate's going to contribute to greater conflict, which is already happening, and if we know factually, as we know in our own context, on our continent, that women pay a disproportionately high level when there is conflict, then in that sense, that's where the connection is. It might seem a bit tenuous, but if it's okay, I would offer to send you to the committee. I could send you a lecture that I did called Rethinking Climate Justice for something called the Fossil Free University, where there is actually a section on gender and climate. So I will send that to Melanie if that's okay. I realize, Chairperson, that's not an adequate answer. Maybe the presentation might help a little more. Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. And good luck with your efforts. It's really important for the people of our country, the people of our continent, and ultimately for the people of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of the meeting. I'm trying to let the meetings not run too long. We've had one or two that went almost, the one that went almost 2 hours, wasn't it? The last one on legislation. Let's not do that again. That was exhausting. So a big thank you, first of all, for Kumi. Thank you very much for taking the time out to be with us. Really, I appreciate it. I know it was a big effort. So thank you very much. And thank you very much, honorable members, Chairperson. I'm very happy to keep on struggling and pushing you, if you are okay with that. I really enjoy organizing this for the members, so I really appreciate it. I know how full your schedules are. I've been there myself, so I know how difficult it is to make time. So thank you very much for that. I know that you are also now going into recess. So thank you, and I hope you have a lovely recess. And when you are back in August, we will still arrange the trip amongst, we're planning a few trips on your request, but the first one will be to the Sustainable Institute. We were hoping to do it this week, but given the pressure that there is on the parliamentary schedule, we realized that was not feasible. So we will do it as soon as you're back from recess. I also just want to thank Susan Lillis from ICCF for joining. She joins us all the way from America. So it's very, very early in the morning when she joins us there with her. So thank you, Susan, for doing that as well. We appreciate that very much.
It's my honor to be here, Chairperson members. Thank you, Melanie, for organizing. And Kumi, that was really a fantastic presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much again. Have a lovely weekend. Stay warm and stay safe.
Bye. Thank you.